I came to Silicon Valley in 1978 after spending 4 years in the U.S. Air Force during Vietnam. And I came out here with maybe a different set of risk profile than others that were here. I remember people telling me about how risky it was to join a startup, and I had just been in a place where risk equals you could die, and I kind of asked, am I missing something? Can you die if your startup fails? And they explained that no, you couldn't, and therefore I always kind of thought I had a bit more of an advantage than others because my version of risk and their version of risk was very different. Hard to die in the United States even if you're out of a job. But in the 1970s, Silicon Valley was still essentially building semiconductors, chips, memory chips, microprocessor chips, etc. The history of the Valley goes back maybe even another 20 or 30 years. They were essentially doing microwave spinouts out of Stanford, components and then systems. And then the defense industry emerged in the mid-1950s with a Lockheed building what were called submarine-launched ballistic missiles in Sunnyvale. Lockheed was, in fact, the biggest employer in Silicon Valley for the first 25 years. And then the Valley moved from wave to wave of technology. First they were doing microwaves, then they did semiconductors. Chip companies like Intel and others emerged, and then personal computers, and then the next wave was the internet, and then by the turn of the 21st century, social media. And so Silicon Valley tends to reinvent itself with every wave of technology. And the reason why is we tend to focus on the entrepreneurs as the crazy innovators. But the other innovation revolution that happened right here was what's called risk capital. Another word for that is venture capital and angel investments. That is, you're willing to make 10 investments knowing that 8 or even 9 of them might fail. But the one that succeeds will pay back multiple times all your other investments. And that kind of financing never existed before the mid-1970s. And so what emerged in parallel with the entrepreneurial culture was the venture capital culture. And then in the 21st century, in addition to venture capital, this whole idea of angel investment at substantial amounts of money. What's unique about the Valley is, number one, the concentration of capital, that is, available money here is probably as high as anywhere else in the world except for possibly Beijing or Shanghai. The second part, though, is part of our culture, which is both an entrepreneurial culture and an American culture. You know, we have a special word in English here for a failed entrepreneur. Do you know what that word is? Experienced. It's a big idea. If you fail in a startup, in an innovation culture in Silicon Valley, your friends, when you go out to coffee with them and you're depressed, you know what the first thing is they ask you? Any idea? They ask you, what's your next startup? Instead of you worrying about you shamed your family or shamed your community or have to leave town or your parents are going to be embarrassed, okay, if it was an honest failure, that is, you didn't steal money, you didn't cheat, you didn't whatever, we get multiple shots at the goal. And that's what makes entrepreneurship here more effective. We're not any smarter, but our culture actually encourages you to take multiple shots, and the investors don't look like you're a failure. They look at you as your experience. On the other hand, there's a lot of changes that have happened since the beginning of this century that have democratized entrepreneurship. And that is, for example, now computing is a utility. Amazon Web Services allows people to kind of plug in, essentially, just like you plug into electricity. You don't worry about what country you're in. You kind of know that there's most places, a regular supply of electricity. We now know there's a regular supply of computing. The other thing that's changed is entrepreneurship used to be a magic craft that we didn't quite know whether there were any rules or how do you do it, or you kind of heard stories from someone else. Well, part of my contribution, and Alexander Osterwalder and Eric Ries, is we invented a methodology called the Lean Startup. And the Lean Startup is kind of a set of common sense rules about things you do when you're building an early stage venture. So instead of magic and craft, there's now a tool set to kind of think about. And then the third part is, while we have more capital, that is more money here for risk than any other place in the world, there are other places in the world with capital. You mentioned Tel Aviv and London and Berlin, and certainly Shanghai and Beijing are also sources of risk capital. So while Silicon Valley, I believe, will still be the mecca, there will be always places now emerging for other places.